is I think the thing that being an artist has given me is actually it's opened up so much, you know, it's created so much possibility. It's actually given me a reason to not be right about something. It's given me a reason to think beyond what has been told to me, or think beyond kind of even what I know. You know, almost as like if I only rely on what I know, then I feel like I'm doing a disservice to the thing that's possible. And so that's why I kind of talk in these ways that feel really big, because like I feel like I can't do that anywhere else, really. You know, or there are very few places. You know, love is maybe another one where it's like when someone asks you to explain to them, it's like, oh, why do you love me? And it's like, you want me to answer that question? You know, like what is the answer to that question? And so I feel like art for me, it doesn't operate, but it exists in a similar way. But I think giving myself permission to do that has been the challenging part, because I think what people do want an answer when they ask you that question. It's like not giving somebody an answer to the question, why do you love me, is gonna make the person feel like, oh, you just don't love me then because you don't have an answer. You're avoiding the answer because there isn't one. And it's like, oh no, I love you so much that there isn't an answer. That's actually more or less how I exist, and I feel like art gives me a practice to practice that kind of existence.
Well, I think it's interesting that Devin, you know, when I hear you talk, you're like, I think of sitting at a bar, and what you're describing are probably like some thoughts that you often have, like when you drive from here to there. You're always thinking about these things. I'm always struck by that. Devin's always thinking. And I think, like when I hear you talk and you put these ideas out there, that if they have a form, that thing that ends up taking up space, I think that is like really tied to your practice, or maybe it is your practice, because you speak these things, they start filling up the room, and then you're curious about how we bump into them, how we move around them, how we navigate them. So it makes sense when you say, you know, if I make a thing in the world, you're not consumed with the idea of, okay, let's name it, who owns it, where does it live, how does it exist, you know, it just is. It's a thing that maybe was on your mind that you had to maybe articulate to some extent with the actual object. But I think the object probably just gets at it in one way, you know, just one way. It's, you know, I think the pondering, the discussing, the thinking as you're driving, as you're moving through the world.
No, I mean, it's so true. It's we have had these conversations before, or a version of them before, we all have. And I think to hear you say that, it's so true, because I'm never not in it. It's just like when someone asks me like, oh, like, well, when do you have time for your practice? I'm like, oh, I'm never not practicing.
Right.
Like, I'm never not practicing. Like, there's never a moment when, like, you're right, the drive here, I was thinking about things. And things is a really good word to use. It's like, I feel like for me, I'm definitely, it's more of a wandering than it is an exploration. You know, it's definitely more intuition, less invention. That's more or less kind of where, I'm not using the word operate. Operate feels like it's more exploration too, but it's more, it's an existence, it's a being, it's a presence. And so I do think about my relationships that way too, you know what I mean? It's like, I try my best to, this is gonna sound maybe really, really weird, but like not get in the way with them, or whatever the case might be. It's like how do you participate, but then like, you know, like not get in the way, essentially, you know.
But you know, the phrase never not is different from saying always. So I'm never not thinking about my practice is different from saying I'm always thinking about my practice. You don't say always, because always would be absolute. And you don't want to be absolute even when you're being absolute. You're never not, which is a kind of a negation of I'm absolutely always thinking. And I think that that's interesting, because I think the practice like you said, Caroline, it is also wrapped up in language. And never not means something different from a double negative. It means something, never not. I'm never not thinking versus I am always absolutely thinking. I don't think you'd ever say, ever, you're absolutely always thinking. You might always say, I am never not thinking.
No, it's so true. I think because when you get to the absolute, and it's funny, I didn't even catch myself, like not even knowing that I don't say always, you know, but like, maybe because it just feels right. I think when I become absolute, it feels right. And again, it's like, oh, there's this thing called rightness, then there's this thing called truth. I'm probably more interested in kind of this thing called truth, not about what's right. And I think about if I become absolute, then I feel myself becoming righteous, and what I feel is absolute. So it's like, oh yeah, truth is the thing that actually like, I'm in it, I'm participating in it, whether or not I realize it or I'm aware of it, you know? So I think that never not probably does lends itself to like a different kind of presence, you know what I mean?
You said something else that struck me. You said that you think beyond what you know. I think that's what you said. And I started thinking about that as I was sitting here, like, there's a kind of permission that one has to afford themselves to do that, thinking beyond what you know, because most people might stop at what you do know, and then there's a hesitancy to act on anything beyond that, because it's not a secure place. You could be wrong. You could be operating out of like untruth or whatever. But I think that's an important space to kind of make in and think in a practice, because I think that I'm always interested in how artists give themselves permissions to do certain things and kind of behaviors, how we're so influenced by each other, and especially when we're in, you know, close relationship with one another. You want to know those things, how one is allowing their interior ideas, the things that they ruminate on. You know, they can always go to a certain point, but when they start to spill over into these, to the questions or to the unknown. But actually, I don't even want to say questions, because questions mean that you have something to get specifically from beyond what you know. When you just start to go beyond what you know in that space, you might find some things. You might learn other things. And that's an interesting space for me to think about.
Yeah, no, I love hearing you say too, like find things, not discover things too, because it's not an exploration that leads to a discovery either. I mean, I think if I begin to kind of start out that way, you know, like, oh, I'm exploring for X to make a discovery of something, then it kind of, it creates a kind of prerequisite around what the journey would be. So then it does become more of an exploration. Like I am out to achieve X or Y, you know, so it really does. Yeah, you know, but it's, I mean, it's challenging. I mean, I think there are moments when, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are totally moments when you do, you've arrived somewhere, and you ask yourself a question like, oh, is this the thing? You know what I mean? Is this it? I'm not quite sure, you know. But I think the beauty of like what it is that I think we have decided to give ourselves permission to be a part of, this thing called art, is that it's a practice. And so I think for me, what really has given me permission is practice. I think because in those moments when I am uncertain, which are most of the time, or I am unsure, or I feel like I don't have this desire to be right necessarily around things, and this question of like wrongness, or this question about like certain level of excellence even, you know, or exhibition. It's another one of those words where it's like, I remember talking to a few people regarding kind of like the practice, and I was having a hard time tying an exhibition to it, actually. I was sharing with them, I was like, I actually don't think I want to be an exhibitionist, you know, and I worry that if it does become a thing that begins with an exploration, that is about making a discovery, that it then becomes an exhibition of my findings, if you will. that it then does, it turns back inward to me in this kind of sense of like, oh, it's about me and what I've been able to achieve in that, you know.
Yeah, that was the word that was on my mind, but Zach, maybe you have some things.
Yeah, I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about your process as well. I mean, you don't have to, but
Depends, you know,
yeah.
I mean, it starts way back in some ways. Like, I think about, okay, what got me into this game, what got me into thinking, what got me into wanting to like mess around with art is early moments I had of just observing the world growing up. And those were mainly happening at home, in the home watching television, but watching my parents watch television because I could learn things. I learned who they were by the way they responded to different things that happened within film or on television. So when my father would laugh at something, I learned something. I was like, oh, I wasn't laughing, but I was noticing when he would laugh, and then I would notice the kind of comments he would make. So like there was this way that I was, I don't know, understanding the way he thinks through his behaviors, like that, simple behaviors too, okay? And I think like also with television, that's one of the earliest moments you start to see difference and you start to see variety. I mean, I grew up in a very small town. And so one of the ways in which I was getting out of that small town was through watching different things, okay? So, you know, my observations came out of thinking about how people were performing in these spaces and how that was distanced from my real life. And it was such a gap. So some of the early questions were like, why do people talk like that? Like this film language? Like that was a big question for me. Like why and how do people arrive to speaking like that? Is that something that's parodied from real life? Is it just mimicking? Did that really happen? I've never heard people talk like that where I'm from. So that early question about performing language was something that just stuck with me. And then as I got older and I go to school and I start meeting people from different parts of the world and recognizing that the way you speak and it moves you through the world in a very specific kind of way. And so, you know, then I'm abroad and I'm thinking, I'm in another country and I'm thinking about how language, you know, can navigate me so far, and then there are these barriers to cross. So all those moments were kind of culminating toward thinking about abstraction, a kind of abstraction that already exists when someone opens their mouth to speak. Because what comes out doesn't match what they look like or who they are or where they're from. All those things, you know. And so I think one of the ways in which it intersected for me with abstract painting was that often hearing about this kind of language that is produced by mark making. Okay, so the language of painting was something my ear was really kind of tuned into, like, oh, it's a language? Yeah. Well, if it's language, I like languages. Let me see what I can do with this language, you know? So it was a moment of like, I've been thinking about language and I've been, you know, as I moved through the world, I was learning other languages and I was attracted to that. So I thought, maybe there's a way these two can intersect. And so this idea of inventing a kind of abstract painting language was enticing because if you make the language, then maybe it's people will come. Like somewhere on down the line, but like first make the language and see what happens. And I think that was exciting enough for me. And so when I started making abstract paintings, to begin with, I was thinking specifically about the country of Romania, which goes back to a conversation Zach and I were having about living in Romania. And I was thinking specifically about being in this foreign landscape and thinking about how would I ever kind of articulate my experiences here in this place. And I thought like painting is so tied to the emotive, tied to experience, you know, so I kind of conflated these elements of the language, the landscape, into these forms that stood in the place of what I'd experienced there. So I think that was like the beginning to get me kind of off and running and thinking in these ways.
Yeah, it's beautiful to hear you talk, Caroline, about the relationship that abstraction for you has to language and languages, and then this mix, this medley of past experiences that are all like communicative and narrative based and outsider-ish, foreign, right? And that abstraction gives you a home for all the wayward parts, you know, where they could then be reshaped into a thing that makes sense to you in form, not in language, not as a new film series, not as a classroom pedagogical moment, but makes sense through this other material, you know, this other medium. And I'm curious, like, are there moments when you're curious, like, are there moments when language pops up or film pops up or other things that you want to do that also help to articulate the artistic gesture besides painting or in addition to painting?
Definitely. Like I said earlier when we were talking, that I always knew that painting was like just to get me in the game, get me started, get me thinking. And I often like to think about painting as the medium I think through ideas with. But there are times when there needs to be a different kind of material, or it needs to be, the thing needs to be done in a different way. And I like to think of that moment as this kind of translation, moving from one medium to the next. And I think of it as like, it's in service to like learning more about this language. It's in service to like figuring out where are the borders of this language, you know. Let's move it into the room, let's get it out into the space so that it breaks the form of the painting. It becomes a shape itself. It moves out into it as an object. It's a freestanding sculpture. It moves into a performance. And that's really for me to like figure out what are all the working parts. And I think, Zach, you had mentioned like, there was a question you had that was like, well, is there a pivotal artwork that somehow like did something? And I think it was, I was thinking about that question. And for me, I don't think it was a specific artwork as much as it was getting all the moving parts in the room. And that took a lot of time because first I did just make paintings. And then I decided to make one sculpture here. And then there were more sculptures. And then there was a freestanding sculpture. I mean, I think there was this moment of like paintings on the wall that became sculptural. And I think the moment everything got into the room, that was the moment I was like, oh, these are all just working parts. This is like, it is like language. I can reassemble these and assemble them. And that felt satisfying. And also like a light bulb kind of went on with that.
Well, for me, it's definitely, I mean, something that Zach mentioned previously, which was you were talking about the kind of, or a few things that came up that I thought was really interesting is like permission, which Caroline, you spoke of, and then but then confidence being this other thing. I never forget that I was having a conversation with my father actually, maybe about maybe a couple of years ago. And we're talking, and I'm sure, I don't know, we're talking about everything. And in the middle of the conversation, he says to me, man, Devin, you really just seem so confident. And I remember like, for some reason rejecting that and like immediately, like, oh no. I think maybe what you're sensing is peace, not confidence. And I think for me, it's actually, it is that peace that gives me permission. I think confidence makes me anxious, actually. And so I think the reason why it can be both everything and nothing is because I'm at peace with it, you know? But if I become confident about it, even in my kind of findings, I don't want it to necessarily become then about the aboutness of my findings in a way where it's supposed to kind of now dictate a destination. You know what I mean? So there's something about kind of like, for me, it's like no, actually it's peace is the thing that I'm trying my best, you know what I'm saying, to be in. That's why even like the kind of notion of like desire or searching or like exploring forward becomes something else, you know what I mean, for me, where it's like, if I can just be in it, which is why I think in these moments of material, which we talk about, whether it be a rug, whether it be a candle, whether it be my body, whether it be a match or a Newport box, these moments of like articulation, these kind of declarations that are happening, is more so kind of my attempt to trust. Like, I'm just trying to just trust something. And maybe the thing that I can trust at this moment is a Newport box that I came across on the ground.
You know, that after hearing you speak now, I have a different way of looking at the Newport cigarette packages. Like, those seem like, to me, if you're talking about your existence within this paradox or within this reality that you live in, and you keep coming across this object that seems to be able to move through the paradigm in really specific and interesting kind of ways without any kind of rules, because those cigarette packages just show up anywhere, you know. And I thought about this before, like they have this kind of way of being able to move and get places that some of us aren't even allowed, you know, that they can get in these spaces. So it makes me think like, yeah, collecting of the thing and even documenting of the thing is not the thing. It's the fact that when you see it, you are reminded of yourself, and that this is the reality you live in alongside a thing like that.
Yeah.
Can I ask like a couple of kooky questions? But I'll start with you, Caroline,
Okay.
because it's something I kept seeing. The night sky and relationship to your work. It seems so present, and I know it's appeared in titles and stuff, but like, I was just curious to hear you talk about the influence of the night sky, the meaning of the night sky for you.
I mean, when you tell me, I start to think like I start doing like psychology in my brain. I'm thinking like, what does that mean? Why do I? I think the cosmos is kind of a space that one can just gaze at and can never get to. Not even if I wanted to. I can't get at it. Yet it's something that it feels like I think of it as a kind of a cloak, something that has the ability to hide things in it. But at the same time, it's visible to us, and it's the unknown. It's also like there's this. I discovered that there's a word for the Earth's boundary when you leave the atmosphere. So when you cross over this, it's called the Kármán line. It's from this Hungarian. And I became interested in that line, like, oh, there's this boundary that exists that's unknown of to us, and we can't even get to the boundary really because it's so far away. But I think I've always been drawn to what is on the other side. I don't even know if I'd call it metaphysics. It's spiritual. It's on the other side of what we understand. And I guess maybe the night sky represents this boundary of going into a place that's unnameable and knowable in some ways. But it's fascinating to like consider. And it's fascinating to like desire to want to know what is in that fabric of the night. And it's just a metaphor in some ways. I mean, yeah, I'm being literal, like I can't get at the thing, but it's maybe metaphoric for the other kinds of spaces I'm interested in. And I think maybe specifically in relation to my work, I was thinking about like, what does it mean for a language to take up its residence in a kind of site of a cosmos that can operate on its own terms, that has maybe hidden agendas, that knows how to reinvent itself, that comes back centuries, that always was, that never wasn't, you know? I think that's the way I think about it in my practice.
Oh, it's a really beautiful answer. Devin, so this is kind of a leftover from last summer maybe, but the sun.
Man, the sun. God, there's so much to say. It's almost like I don't. It's the thing that I can't. Maybe I'll answer this with more so kind of a thing that me and my pops will do. Like he'll always call me. When I left Detroit, and I went to college, and then I moved to Chicago. And I don't know how much you all know about Detroit, but like it tends to be gray there often. Like I don't know why, just growing up, the skies were always gray, and that's probably why I feel good about gray skies now, maybe, because I just was around them so much. But my pops began to call me and ask me like all the time, like, hey, Dev, is the sun shining? And he started doing this when I left. And I used to always kind of give him a forecast, like, oh yeah, it's partly cloudy, whatever. But it wasn't until recently, and he's been doing this for years, he asked me again, and he says, well, Devin, is the sun shining? And I responded to him, I said, you know, Pop, the sun is always shining. You know, and it's funny, that's actually probably when I've used that word. And he kind of laughed. He said, I guess so. You know, I guess you're right, like, you know. The sun is never not But yeah, that just, yeah, but no, it feels like the sun has been, if there are things that feel absolute, you know, when I do speak of always, and I think the sun is actually that thing for me that feels, whether or not I understand or perceive as light to be shining or not, that feels like, that feels almost kind of like, this gets back to Caroline, kind of this notion of like beyond what I know. It's like, sure, the sun is shining because I can see things in the distance, and then all of a sudden I'm like, well, I can no longer see things in the distance, so the sun isn't shining anymore. And so I began to kind of think about it like, oh, the sun is always shining, whether or not I can see is a whole other question. And so I think the sun for me has been something that I continue to kind of return to, if you will, that helps me, reminds myself that all things are true, you know. And so I think there are other artists and moments that also kind of like think about the sun and use the sun as a reminder or as a return. Turia is one that comes to mind. Alice Coltrane, for people that don't speak about her, as Turia. But I often, she's very active in my practice too, as someone else that kind of thinks about the sun. And so, yeah, when I first hear the sun, those are the things I think about. Probably Alice Coltrane, and my father asking me, is the sun shining?
That's awesome. I should Theaster was there too, but Devin read like this amazing poem at this performance last summer. It was really fun.
I'll read it to you later. I'll read it to you later. It's fine. It's fine. Thank you for asking, and thank you for like Zach helping to coordinate this. This has been really good.
This is great.
Yeah.
Is it time for the real talk?
I think so.